couple of weeks ago, I did a video talking about some of the models we might be seeing coming in the upcoming Ashes of Malifaux expansion, specifically pulling stuff out of the Through the Breach bestiaries from all the expansions. There's a whole bunch of models in those bestiaries that we've never seen come to the game, and Wyrd has a tendency to take stuff that's been in the bestiaries for Through the Breach and bring them over to Malifaux. Now, you guys seem to really like that video, so what I'm going to do in this video is talk about some of the characters who have only showed up in the lore who might have a chance of coming over to the game. Some of these are going to be a little bit deeper cuts, and I bet some of them are going to be characters that you've never even heard of. But I'll go over who the characters are, where they come from, and where they might fit in the game. So let's jump into it. A long time ago, when the Tyrant War was happening, the people got together and started defeating the tyrants and imprisoning them in different ways. As they were closing in on the dragon, it actually decided to split itself in two to escape being imprisoned. It flung one half of itself back to Earth, and that's the half that we now know is possessing Shenlong, and the other half ended up in the bayou. Fast forward to present day, and there's this human woman who's in the bayou known as the Black Dragon. Now, she seems to have some sort of strange necromantic magic that she teaches to some of the gremlins. Now, we don't really know much about her motivations or what she's up to, but it seems like there's a good chance that she's actually possessed by the other half of the dragon. She's a little bit mysterious, but if she is possessed or being influenced by half of a tyrant, then she's probably going to be pretty important in the story and the lore in the long run. So it wouldn't be surprising if we saw her come to the game. Now, I think if she's got influence from a tyrant, then that means she's probably got to be master level when she comes to the game. So this might be something that we don't see for a long time until they add 10th masters or start replacing some masters. But it would be really interesting to see another human master come to the bayou. As far as we know, she only associates with gremlins, particularly of the Numa family. And we know that she's able to use necromantic magic to summon some sort of spirits that take physical form and then can do her bidding. And she even teaches some of those abilities to other gremlins. So I think this would make a really cool bayou crew with the Black Dragon as the master and then a whole bunch of necromancer gremlins in her crew. Maybe she'd be a summoner where she can pull in these spirits from some other dimension, and it would be really interesting to see what type of monsters would come to a crew like that. Cyril Mullock works for the guild in the Witch Hunters division. After one of his operations went pretty wrong, Tony Ironsides actually came in and saved his life, and as a result, the two developed a grudging respect for each other. They bonded over games of poker and their enjoyment of reading, and you can tell that Tony really likes the guy, because she didn't beat him to a pulp immediately when the Governor General sent him to her office to try to see if the two could cooperate. Now, this is a character that we see interacting with Ironsides a few times, and I'm not really sure if he came to the game if it would make sense for him to actually work with Tony. They socialize with each other a bit, but there's definitely still a conflict of interest there, and I'm not sure they'd be cozy enough with each other to actually be in the same crew. But it would be really interesting to see a Witch Hunter and Arcanist dual keyword model. That's definitely an unlikely pairing from a lore perspective, but rather than giving him the Witch Hunter and MNSU keywords, maybe it would make more sense if he was just a Witch Hunter but had a special rule that allowed him to be hired into Tony Ironside's crews. That could sort of reflect the fact that they're on good terms, but he doesn't really work for the Arcanists, and that this isn't really a normal thing. It would be interesting to see what type of rules he would get that would distinguish him from the other Witch Hunter models, but in the lore it definitely seems like he commands some respect, and he seems to even work independently of Sonya Crit in some situations. Plus, we know that he was working directly for the Governor General once Marlowe took over, so maybe that could be reflected in his rules a little bit as well. Either way, it's an interesting character that I think I would like to see more of in the lore coming up, and it would be really cool to see him come across to the tabletop as well. The Dead Man's Ball is one of those stories that I feel like is really well loved by the fans, and almost nothing from that story has ever really gone anywhere. We get some really interesting looks at the different Resurrectionist characters, and we see them interacting with each other in ways that we don't really see in other stories. But this is supposed to be an annual thing, and I really wish they would make reference to it or have a whole other Resurrectionist Ball in another story coming up. But either way, Gwen is the main character of that story, and she's always been really interesting to me. I've actually brought her up in this context before in the past, but I think it would be a really interesting new character for the Resurrectionists. When we first meet her, we see her trying to resurrect her dead dog, which I feel like is something that we can all kind of empathize with. And then she shows up at the ball, and she's confronted with all of these horrible things that she's not used to seeing before, because she's just started dabbling in necromancy. And of course she has an encounter with Seamus, which is terrifying, but she ends up surviving and making it home safe. And she even keeps a little souvenir from the experience. Now, we know that later down the road, Nicodem actually kills off a lot of the other necromancers, especially the unnamed ones, when he's trying to consolidate his power and kind of recruit all of their undead to his army. But I like to think that Gwen might have survived all of that, especially considering that they had a friendly relationship with each other. Now, it's been a long time since we last heard from Gwen, so it's possible that she's gotten a lot more powerful and could come to the game as a full-on master, but I think it's more likely that she'd show up in another Resurrectionist crew. Now, maybe she and Seamus will patch things up, and I'm sure he wouldn't be too upset about adding another girl to his crew, but I think it would be even more interesting if she had some sort of mechanic that actually tied her in with Nicodem. Whether they're going to bring Nicodem back to the game or not, I think it would be interesting if her mechanics actually paid homage to the fact that they had a relationship previously. Maybe something that allowed her to work well with Asura Rotten and buff the mindless zombies, or even just some reference in the text to some of her abilities. Either way, cool character, and I hope we get to see her in the game one day. If you caught the video I referenced earlier, then you might remember me talking about the swamp people. So these are models from the bestiary from Into the Bayou. And they're actually humans who live on the borders of the bayou, but are a little bit more uncivilized and have learned to sort of adapt to living in those conditions. We know that there's some gremlins from the bayou who actually come out of the bayou and interact with humans, and these are sort of the humans that have done it the other way around. But what's even more interesting is that we're introduced to a named character among their group, called Heloise. Now there's really no indication of whether she's a leader among her people, but we do know that most of her people use bladed weapons and bows because they're a little bit safer to use in the wet environments of the bayou. But she uses guns. So either she's a little more careful or she's a little bit more powerful than the rest of them. But either way, I think it would be an interesting way to incorporate a character into the game that bridges that gap between human society and the bayou. We get a teeny bit of that with the smugglers and the Zip and Parker relationship, but it's definitely something I'd like to see come to the game more. And maybe one day we'll even see gremlins who are relevant to the overall story of Malifaux. Now, with a name like Gilgamesh, I was going to put this character on the list pretty much no matter what. But luckily, this character also has an interesting backstory that I think would make a unique addition to the game. So Gilgamesh is a guild operative who actually operates in the north, sort of overseeing the different guild spies who are trying to get information on the Arcanists. The guild's power outside of the city of Malifaux is actually pretty limited, partially just because of the logistics of the situation, but also because they're mostly just worried about keeping the breach secure and continuing the flow of soulstones back to Earth. But they obviously like to expend their power as far as they can, so they have operations in places like Edgepoint and Ridley and all over the northern hills where a lot of the soulstone mines are. Gilgamesh in particular is apparently adept at understanding the intricacies and the workings of the Union, which makes him particularly good at overseeing all the spies who are trying to get more information and sort of manipulating the Union and making sure they're doing what the guild wants. As far as where he would fit in the game, it's actually a really interesting question. We only have a little bit of information about his backstory, and none of it really ties him in directly with one guild master. The fact that he's sort of a spy master sort of ties him in with Lucius a little bit, I think. But for some reason, he doesn't really seem to fit in with the vibe of that crew to me. But I'm not sure I can really put my finger on why. But hey, maybe he would be a good option for just a strictly versatile guild model. Something you can sort of slot into any crew that you want, and he would be particularly good at going up against the Arcanists. Maybe he could have ways to counter magic or get around armor. Hey, before we continue with the video, if you like what you've seen so far, then don't forget to leave the video a like, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. Also consider sharing the video with somebody who you think might find it interesting. There's a bunch of links below in the description. You can check out the link to the Discord where you can come hang out with me and chat with the rest of the community. I also have the Wyrd affiliate link, so if you're going to be shopping on Wyrd's web store, then you can do that through my link, and everything will be exactly the same except the channel gets a little bit of a kickback. We also have the Defective Dice merchandise store where you can pick up stuff with my logo on it, and we also have the Patreon where you can get early access to videos, ad-free versions of the videos, access to polls where you can vote on upcoming content, and all sorts of other cool perks. But with that commercial over, let's get back to the lore. Now, there are a lot of Neverborn characters that were introduced in From Nightmares that I think could make interesting additions to the game. A couple of obvious choices would be Athana, the other members of the Ada Kithay, and Miss Violet. But this isn't much a wish list as it is anything else, so the person I want to talk to you about is Vona the Astronomer. Now, like a lot of these characters, we don't have a ton of information about Vona, but what we do know about her is particularly interesting. She's actually one of the last Dreaming Ones, which were a group of the Fae who existed back in the day and had been all but eradicated by Lord Chompybits or Nightmare. So she's technically not related to the Nephilim, but she actually lives in a secluded place where she interacts with black blood shamans, and most people don't even know of her existence, even among the Neverborn. And in that way, she kind of reminds me of Castor before he was reawoken. Now, due to her backstory, you would very much expect that she would have access to abilities that we haven't seen in the game before. And according to her lore, she actually has the ability to drain or boost magic in different places in Malifaux. We also know that she's been reluctant to get involved in any of the politics of Malifaux, but I bet with a lot of the tyrants coming back and trying to take over, that could definitely change. The only trick there is that I think if she does come to the game, she's got to be Master Tier, which means that she's either going to be a 10th Master for the Neverborn, or we're going to have to wait until some of the other Masters get demoted or moved around, maybe in the next edition of the game. Either way, it'll be really interesting to get a look at what a Dreaming One actually looks like. We know that they used to live in Malifaux City. They were the Fae that actually built the city itself. But we don't really have a good idea of what they look like. Aside from Nightmare, who used to be a Dreaming One, but that's probably not what they look like. It'll also be a really cool way to bring some brand new mechanics or abilities into the game because she's so different from everything else that we've seen in the game before, even among the other Neverborn and Fae. One of my favorite things to see in the Malifaux lore is when we see a subversion of the traditional relationships between different groups in the story. So for example, the gremlins tend not to interact with the humans. They kind of just mind their business in the bayou and beat up or rob or kill any humans that they interact with. And likewise, the humans are kind of on site with gremlins. There's a bounty on their head, and they don't really interact with them in a peaceful way most of the time. But when we do see that, I think it's really interesting, and I'd like to see more of it in the future. The same thing goes for the Neverborn. Obviously, most of the Neverborn either eat humans or prey on humans in an emotional, darker way. But on the rare occasion that we see a more nuanced interaction between humans and Neverborn, I think it's really interesting. Now, Mr. Harvey is not exactly a peaceful or good character, but I find it really interesting nonetheless because it's a little bit different than the way we usually see Neverborn interacting with humans. So Mr. Harvey and his quote-unquote daughter, Jasmine, actually own and work in a curio shop in Malifaux. It's called Harvey's Antique Coins and Curios. In reality, Mr. Harvey is actually a mimic, and Jasmine is actually a woe. And you won't be surprised to hear that the two of them are not exactly the best business people. In reality, they're actually taking advantage of people, manipulating them, and in many cases, causing their deaths. Which is exactly what you'd expect out of a mimic and a woe. But either way, I think it's actually interesting to see that they actually live and work inside the city and they interact with people on a regular basis. We actually first got introduced to them in a Wyrd Chronicles story called A Bad Penny, where a coin that was stolen from their shop actually goes around to a bunch of different people and causes them horrible misfortune and death. But hey, maybe one day we'll see them interact with people in a less hostile way. As far as coming to the game, I think it would be interesting to see them working together, so maybe they would share a keyword between Pandora and Lucius. But they've also been known to work with a Nightmare, so there's potential there that they could also work with Dreamer as well. And I'm thinking abilities that revolve around swindling people or stealing from them would work really well for both of them, as well as maybe putting curses on people. So it's been a couple years now since Dr. McMorning made his dramatic exit from the guild. And now that he's gone, he's actually been replaced by a guy named Mark Walkenhurst. Now, we don't really know too much about this guy, but we know that in the position as coroner now, he's got a lot more scrutiny over him because McMorning was getting away with a whole bunch of stuff for a really long time. So now he's got death marshals overseeing his work and making sure that all those bodies stay dead. Now, so far there's been no indication that he's been doing anything like Dr. McMorning, but it would be interesting to see him come to the game nonetheless. I could see him being an interesting addition to the Lady Justice crew because he would obviously be an expert in handling dead bodies and maybe disposing of them, which goes along with her whole theme pretty well. Plus, it seems like he could be a pretty important character in the lore because that's an important position at the guild, even though everybody at the guild is going to be pretty sensitive about it considering what happened in the past. We know Lady Justice is pretty upset about the fact that this was going on right under her nose all this time, so it might be pretty interesting to see how she treats him and if he can earn her respect and become a valuable member of the team, or if he's always going to be an outcast. And maybe if he's an outcast, that could potentially push him to some more unsavory folks. I don't think we'll get a whole repeat of Dr. McMorning, but being around all those dead bodies all the time is probably going to have an influence on this guy, and the Whisper is strong in Malifaux, so maybe this guy will handle the pressure better, but who knows. So as the Miners and Steamfitters Union started expanding its power, they actually started opening up what they called company towns. Now, this is a similar idea to things that happen in real life where corporations would basically run towns, but instead, here we have the Union actually doing it. They would build the infrastructure, they would set up houses and shops and all that sort of stuff. And then the people that lived there and worked for the Union would actually have some of their pay taken to support living in the town. Now, there's obviously going to be problems with an arrangement like this, but one of the things that it allowed them to do was to keep the guild out of their hair. And the first really successful version of this was a town called Jubilee, which was run by a guy named Mike Ewex. He was basically a laborer who eventually got elected mayor of this town, and now he runs the place, but the people that live there don't really like him very much. I think he'd be an interesting character to bring over to the game because I like characters that show the sort of mundane and more normal sides of life in Malifaux. And I also think it'd be interesting to see how he works for the Union, and he's pretty high up in the Union, but he also isn't liked very much by the rest of the people, which is unusual. Most people in the Union are pretty well liked by the average people. As far as coming to the game itself, I think he would fit pretty well in Ironside's crew. He is a politician, and he's obviously high up in the Union, so I think he would go with her theme of kind of being laborers and organizers and lawyers and politicians and things like that. But thematically, I feel like maybe it would make sense for him to be versatile so he could work with everybody in the Union. Either way, I think it would just be interesting to get more stories about this guy because I want to see a little bit more of the sort of normal people and get a little bit more information about the types of lives that people lead on the outskirts of the city. So as we've been getting more and more lore about the Three Kingdoms and learning more about their histories and backgrounds, one of the things that we've learned is that the Vietnamese have become extremely skilled gunsmiths. We see that a lot on the other side. A lot of the new units that are coming for the Three Kingdoms that are Vietnamese are focused around high-tech weapons. And in the From Shadows book earlier this year, we got a little bit of information about a character named Kay Huynh. She was actually raised by gunsmiths and became a gunsmith herself, and then eventually made her way over to Malifaux and moved to the Little Kingdom, where she opened up a shop. Apparently she's got a great reputation for the quality of her merchandise, and I think it would be really interesting to see somebody who's an expert on guns in the Ten Thunders, because that's not something that we've really seen much of before. It might make sense for her to be versatile for Ten Thunders, but Ten Thunders already has so many versatile models that I feel like maybe it would be better if she got slotted into a crew. Misaki's crew might make a little bit of sense, and maybe they'll synergize with the snipers a bit, But I also feel like she might make sense in Mei Fang's crew, because first of all, Mei Fang has this very militant, sort of revolutionary attitude, which I think goes along pretty well with what we know about the Vietnamese and how they fought so hard to fight off the guild. But also she's got the whole forging and metalworking theme to her crew, and that might make a lot of sense with somebody who works on guns. And that's it for 10 characters that I think need to come to Malifaux from the lore. Now, there's obviously tons and tons of characters from the lore that have not shown up in the game yet. A lot of them are dead, but there's a whole bunch out there that have survived. So drop me a comment below and let me know what character you want to see come to the game the most. And also tell us where you think they'd fit in, what crew, and what kind of mechanics they would be working with. It's always interesting to me to see how the designers adapt the characters from the lore and what type of mechanics they give them in the game. Ashes of Malifaux should be coming out pretty soon, so there's not a whole bunch of time left, but let me know if you want to see more videos like this where we speculate about the different types of things that we might see coming out in the book. We've already seen a whole bunch of teasers, and I've been putting out shorts on the channel to give you a little bit of insight into their lore, so make sure you check those out as well. But with that, I want to give a huge shout out to the extremely cool kids here on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatized, and Biclops Gladiator Games, and thanks for watching.